Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to the Humanities class. Now, we are done with ancient Greece, and as you can see, we are moving on to unit number 2, which is ancient Rome. A favorite of a lot of history nerds, a favorite of all the men who think about the Roman Empire constantly. We're going to go through Rome relatively quickly, only about 2 videos. First, we're going to start off today with just a bunch of kind of overview conceptual notes for the history of ancient Rome. You'll notice that I did not cover virtually any concrete history of ancient Greece, simply because when kind of planning out the humanities class, again, for a ninth grade sort of audience, I really tried to filter out what is essentially important from each of these civilizations. So that was a pretty strong value judgment on my part. So when looking at a culture like ancient Greece, I think there's a fair argument to be made that there's a lot more of their fictional and cultural works that are more influential and important for us to familiarize ourselves with, more so than there are historical details of ancient Greece, like the Peloponnesian Wars and all this kind of stuff, or the conflicts with, Sparta and Athens. I think it's, and Alexander the Great, of course. I think it's much more interesting, again, at a ninth grade kind of level for a basic humanities understanding, to understand those things. Whereas with ancient Rome, I think that's where we shift a little bit more into kind of concrete history and sort of more primary sources. So that's what we're going to do for about 2 videos here. So we begin with ancient Rome. Now, ancient Rome, and again, we are going to be following along with our basic notes here. So if you have a copy of this, you can go ahead and kind of follow along with me. But as you can kind of see, we're going to start with just some basic understanding about the founding. We're going to talk about the myth of Romulus and Remus. We're going to talk about the extra timeline of ancient Rome. So we're going to plot that out so you can get an idea as to what was going on during what different period of ancient Rome, because there's about 3 major periods in Roman history. Then we're going to talk about the forms of government that it had. Those were the 3 major periods in the civilization and what those looked like. Then we're going to talk about maybe like the 4 major contributions that Rome had to the world and to history. And then that'll be it for today. It's a relatively simple kind of walkthrough for today's lesson. So, ancient Rome, founded in the 8th century BC. So, ancient Rome, if you remember from the introduction notes in the beginning of humanities class, ancient Rome falls at about 476 AD. So we can round that out, to be about 500 AD, right? So about 500 years there, and then about 800 years here. So that leaves you with almost 1,300 years of history, right? There's a lot of history with ancient Rome. It's a very long-lasting civilization. And we're going to have to keep that in mind as we discuss or as we read through some of the primary documents concerning its fall. But this is when it's founded. So we have some simple tribes kind of settling in the area that would become Rome. And of course, we have what do you want to call it? The foundation story of Romulus and Remus, which I want to address really quickly. So if you look in the notes, we know when it was founded, and it was the myth surrounding the founding of Rome is, of course, of Romulus and Remus. So if you go even to this day to ancient Rome, you will see this picture here, this kind of image right here of the she-wolf kind of suckling these 2 young human babies, these 2 brothers, Romulus and Remus. Story goes is that the 2 boys were abandoned and that they eventually were nursed by a wolf mother. And they eventually grow up to found the city of Rome, and they eventually fight with each other over who can rule it. And who wins, of course, is the brother Romulus. And then he, of course, names the city after himself, Rome, right? Not Remus. It wouldn't have been Remulus, right? So the more interesting question I have when looking at the founding myth of a particular nation, of a particular civilization, is how does this characterize them from the very beginning? Well, a couple different things. Orphaned, right? So it is a culture that is defined by almost its kind of lack of an origin, by its lack of a proper historical background. They can't trace their lineage back like, for example, a civilization like the Hebrew civilization can. The Hebrews are very, very, proud of and very, very conscious of the extenuating genealogy that goes into their history. Romans not so much, right? Romans have in their mythology, at least in their psyche, this kind of idea that they are, you know, a little bit different. They just kind of settled here and don't have this long genealogical history in this area. So that's one feature. What else? The suckling with the she wolf. This kind of almost animalistic or almost kind of communion that they have with nature around them. So they're trying to draw on all of the resources of the natural world and also all of the ferocity that they can with that natural world. So they're kind of born into difficulty, into strife. I think there's a little bit of that reflected. If I want to stretch that out a little bit, I think you could say there's some of that idea reflected in the location of their civilization. They are located in the center of the Mediterranean, in some sense, in the center of the European, the Mediterranean world. So they kind of like begin in this relatively harsh, and we're going to see a very, very competitive environment. It's a little bit of that in there. Okay, so we have the orphans, we have the she-wolf suckling, and then we have the problems between the brothers, right? This conflict between the brothers. I think there's 2 points in there. There is the obvious point about the competitiveness of Rome, the very aggressive attitude that it has, this dominating sort of attitude it has, this striving towards victory. That's a somewhat positive aspect to them. But there's also in terms of their future success, but there's also the negative side of that in the sense that it is with their own brothers that they are struggling against. So it's sort of almost a foreshadowing of how bloody the conflicts within Rome will end up becoming. So it is a very, how would you phrase it? A relatively negative aspect to their founding myth, that there is an inherent foreshadowing, an inherent sense of fraternal violence inside this particular story. Okay. Now, moving on from that, when did Rome reach the height of its strength, as it's being asked here in the notes? Well, if we look, we can see that its greatest strength was in the 100s AD. Okay, so the Roman Republic reaches kind of the pinnacle of its strength at that point. Okay, I'm sorry, not the Republic, the Empire, right? So it reaches this point pretty early on. Okay. Now, looking at this for a minute, we have a wonderful map here of the Mediterranean world. So the Roman Empire, as we can see here, stretches all the way down to kind of the northern section of Egypt, right? It has Alexandria. It's got a lot of the Middle East stretching into Syria, and also stretches all the way up to what is now current day Britain, all the way up to Hadrian's Wall over here in the upper part of Britain. Okay, so it's a vast empire in the Mediterranean and the European worlds, right? They're not able to get up into, you know, what is modern day Poland and into like a lot of modern day, you know, what do we call it, the Russian kind of area, the northern European sections. But everything else they had a connection with everything else, and as we're going to see, they were successful for their ingenuity in a lot of different ways through this region, through these regions. Now, to look back at the notes real quick, I want to take a gander at the timeline before we go through this particular section of the monarchy and all this. So for the first part of the timeline, you should mark that there is the beginning of the civilization in the 8th century, okay? So if we want to count these out, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. It's about 19 of them. Right, so we say like this first one is going to be 8th century BC. So 8, we have 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If this, or right here, is going to be 0 AD, right? So this is when Jesus is born, and we have that turn of the calendar. So we have all of Rome existing since that point. And after this, we have, let's see, 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th. Right, and that is where Rome will fall. So Rome lasts this long in history. Okay, we have the founding over here in the 8th century. Then we have the growth of the empire reaching its pinnacle in 100 AD, and then we're going to shift over to the monarchy and the empire and the republic, kind of interchanging government systems. So we know when it collapses, we know that its government form changes, but let's get the actual stats down for what's going on and where. So we had an old timeline. Remember, we had this timeline from when we were talking about the overview of history in the opening notes of the humanities class. Just to refresh your memory, we know that Judaism was one of the oldest dates we had of it. We could say either 13 or 1800 BC, depending on who you're talking to. So somewhere around there up to the present day. So really, really long. It's starting or it's around, somewhat like 1,000 to about 500 to 1,000 years before Rome is founded. We have Judaism being established. The Trojan War, or the war with Ilia, is around 1200 BC. If it did happen, we suspect it probably did happen. There wasn't a campaign against Troy. It's probably going to be about, the 1200 years BC. So again, about 400 to 500 years before Rome's founding. Homer's writing at 800 BC. Okay, so right when Homer is composing the Iliad and the Odyssey, we have Rome essentially being established and founded. Okay, it's a good little parallel of history. We know that Plato was writing about Socrates about 350 BC, so well into the establishment of Rome as a major power, not having yet conquered Greece, but still being still around. Now, we're going to talk about the Roman proper, the Roman Republic. When did that actually begin? That's usually when a lot of historians like to really begin when Rome is going to begin its history, but I like to give you the very beginning of it, right? So you can plot some of these on our timeline if you like, just to give you some comparisons like these last few here. Now let's look at the actual government forms, and we can see these in the notes as well. But I also included the dates up here, so I want you to mark the dates in that timeline so we can see where these are kind of playing out. Rome established itself first and foremost as a monarchy, ladies and gentlemen. That is how the civilization begins. It starts out with having a king, right? What does that mean? Monarchy, one ruler. Archy means ruler, mono means one, right? So the king, as it says, has military, executive, and judicial power, appoints offices, and was the religious mediator. So we essentially have what is essentially a dictator, an authoritarian, a centralized power in one figure for around 250, 260 years in ancient Roman history. Okay, so for quite a while, they sit there as a monarchy. Now, beneath the king, we had a Roman Senate established. And as it says here, that was an advisory council of 300 men that would represent the three major tribes in ancient Rome. Okay, so even in its inception, even in its first form of government, we did have a Senate. Why is the Senate important? Because the Senate's going to remain a central point of the Roman system as we move forward. The next section from that 509 period to about 27 BC, we have the Roman Republic. Okay, so for about if you do the math here, it's probably about 460. 400, depending how you want to, depending on that circa date, somewhere around 450 years, we have the Roman Republic establishing itself. And then, as we said, it'll eventually reach its peak in about another 150 years. But in the Roman Republic, how is it different essentially from the monarchy? Well, the monarchy is disillusioned, is dissolved, is removed. Romans become in this period, very, very anti-monarchy. They don't like the idea of having someone rule for too long with too much power. So they establish the office of what we call consuls, which, as it says, are directing the government and the army and acted as judges, and both had to agree on decisions. Okay, the term both there is the main point, that we had to have two consuls. So sometimes what would happen is that you would have two or three or four major Roman senators running for the office of consul, right? They would have their little campaigns, but it wasn't a single winner that would elect kind of a vice president, kind of like how we do nowadays in America. It was essentially whichever two senators got the most votes. And what very often would happen was that those senators were very much opposed to each other. So the example I give to my class is usually like this. It would run as if we were having the Democrats and the Republicans in America running for consul, and whichever two won would be the consul. So it was if we would have two presidents. So in our last election cycle, it would be like both Donald Trump and Joe Biden being co-consuls and co-presidents, having to rule together. Now, it's an interesting setup as a republic, right? Because then they would have to, check and balance each other. They would have to make agreements. They would have to make kind of concessions to each other. There was never one party or one group that was going to hold an enormous amount of sway. So we had that really enforced sort of balance. The Senate was also still around. Okay, they approved and disapproved laws, made decisions about foreign relationships, and they acted as representatives for the people still. So again, still a very firm presence in the republic. We also had the assembly, which were the elected government officials who voted on laws and declared war or peace. Okay, that was sort of the voice of the people underneath the Senate. Okay, so we had, in some sense, I wouldn't say three branches, but at least three distinct groups in the Roman Republic for this 450 plus years. Of course, what happens? At the end of that period, we have the emergence of the figure of Julius Caesar, and who slowly starts to consolidate power around himself and results, or causes or helps kind of spring forward the dramatic events around his life where he, appoints someone to be his heir, to be, as he is a singular counselor and dictator essentially, and we eventually have the establishment through Caesar Augustus, Octavius Caesar, as the first true Roman emperor, the first true kind of quote unquote tyrant of ancient Rome. Now, that continues up until Rome's fall in 476 AD, even though I put the date here as 395, simply because after that point, Rome does start to slowly just collapse, and its government form reflects that as well. It starts to break up and all this kind of stuff. So the emperor had what sort of power in the government? He had the power to appoint government officials like senators and lawmakers. He was the religious and military head and could declare war as well. So you can see here how the emperor has sort of absorbed a lot of the power of the assembly and the power of the Senate. And the Senate, however, gained all the power of the assembly and was subjected to the emperor. So you've kind of had this kind of like shifting off of power. A lot of the responsibilities of the Senate got absorbed into the emperor's power, and whereas the assembly got absorbed into the Senate. Now, that is the sequence of the Roman government. So again, if you want to copy and plot these particular dates on the timeline, that's relatively useful. You can see, though, that the longest period in ancient Rome was the Republic, and the second longest, of course, was the Empire. We had that very brief 200 and so years of monarchy before we ended up shifting into the more properly understood Roman history. Okay, now take a look at the notes again, make sure that you have those particular forms of government plotted out. Now, a couple things here we want to consider. Rome transitions to an empire, okay? One thing that I want you to be aware of is after this transition, what kind of contributes to the fall of this particular empire, okay, to the collapse of this empire? It's around for over 1,000 years until what happens, essentially? Well, there's no singular huge event that explodes Rome. Like Rome wasn't hit by, a divine meteor, a historical meteor that caused it to collapse overnight. Instead, what happened was that there was a slow erosion of a couple different factors and systems and customs within Rome that caused it to effectively collapse and no longer be around today. Although some, as we're going to see, some of my history teachers and some historians like to joke that Rome didn't fall, it just changed its profession and it still exists to this day under a new name. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the first contributing factor that caused Rome to fall was political figures, politicians becoming more interested in their own wealth. So we had this kind of decrease of nationalism, this kind of more widespread self-interest of the politicians, right? They started to really amass power for themselves, not really care about the populace, not care about the nation of Rome, if you want to call it that. And that just became too pervasive for too long, okay? Not going to be very stable for a long-lasting civilization. Second feature here was the continued expansion of new regions and new land. As we saw with the map before, Rome at its peak was, yes, stretching all the way into what is nowadays Great Britain, all the way down to ancient Egypt. So it really was expanding through essentially the entire Mediterranean world to control the whole area. However, the further and further it expanded, you can kind of see the problem. The more difficulty it had in maintaining control and a legitimate presence in those areas. So essentially, it runs into the issue of it spreading itself too thinly across these regions, and therefore its power and its wealth become diminished over time. So it could rule over Italy and the generally kind of neighboring areas that it had during the Republic. But then the further it spreads in its empire and its imperial manifestation, it starts to have less and less power because it's kind of reaching out way too far, trying to control too much. Okay. And then, of course, the really popular one to point out is that Rome had many attacks and invasions from barbarian tribes and barbarian groups during this period as well. So yes, there were some external factors that were causing Rome to fall, but again, that kind of goes hand in hand with its own internal weakness and own internal erosions. If those same attacks had taken place, 300 years earlier during the height of the Republic or even the height of the Empire, they would have had a totally different results, right? It would not have been able to collapse at that point. I think those, if anything, those invasions, as bold and as damaging as they were the result of perceived weakness from ancient Rome. So these tribes were emboldened as a result to attack Rome, which has contributed to the speed of their downfall. Okay. So that's a general, really, really quick overview of ancient Rome. Now, to close off these particular notes, a couple different things. First and foremost, with your understanding, my students have a little bit of a difficulty understanding the term republic over and against the term democracy, right? Especially in America, we get those terms conflated and confused quite a bit. Really easy way to understand it is this. Democracy is much more of a Greek concept, where the assembly, in other words, the majority of people, hold the power over the state and can impose their will on the minority. So, for example, as I was told, as I always demonstrate in my classes, if the majority of the people in the class vote to, for example, have ice cream be the major meal of the day, it's going to be the major meal of the day. If, however, on one day, the majority of the people vote for, let's say women to not be allowed to leave the home, then they could vote on that. If they vote, for example, to, let's say, kill a certain minority of people in civilization, a democracy could vote on that. So it's dangerous as much as it is effective and maybe beneficial at times. Democracy is the open will of the majority kind of having the rule. The difference between that and a republic is here, where we have elective representatives making decisions, but that cannot change basic rights. So ancient Rome, as we're going to see, did have a set kind of standard of basic rules that could not be overturned, that they would not overturn. That sounds a lot like the American Declaration of Independence, right? The laws and the Bill of Rights and all this kind of stuff. So like a constitutional republic or constitutional monarchy is usually what that's referred to as later in history. Rome had kind of a simple proto version of that, where we had some basic rules and standards that we were not going to overturn, and we had people that were going to represent the assembly that were going to come and vote on their behalf. So this representative idea, that is what a republic is, okay? So it's not the entire group of the masses voting, it's the elected representatives of those masses voting based on some previous rights, okay? So America, by the way, of course, is a republic in that sense. Okay, now the contributions of ancient Rome, I've boiled them down to 4 major contributions. We're going to talk about them really quick. I'm going to talk about their impact on history. The first one, as we've been discussing, is government, the impact on government. Like we just said, we can see the parallels between how the founding fathers of America were deeply inspired by the structure of ancient Rome, right? So first and foremost, Rome had what was called the 12 tables, these laws that were very common, very, very much understood by the populace throughout the Republic and the Empire, that were their written laws and principles. So great point right there, that we have a lot of different nations throughout history following Rome take inspiration from. We, of course, had the idea of elected representatives. This was a particularly, innovative thing that they decided to do. They were not going to just have everyone kind of stand and shout in the assembly for what they want, but we're going to have a particular group or a particular, collection of people that were going to represent that particular group. So we're going to vote on a person, that person is going to go to the government, and that person is going to act on our behalf, okay? And of course, the attempt at a balance of power within the consuls. This is one of the first times, or first really noteworthy times in history, that we see a government trying to balance the power within its different branches, its different groups. Again, it's not perfect. It's not anywhere near as effective as we're going to see the American system was, but it's something. It's something that's pretty noteworthy, right? As we can kind of understand when you heard about the consuls, in theory, it seems to be a really interesting, effective idea. So these principles, these ideas, again, very influential, very popular, coming from ancient Rome. Something else that you probably, especially if you're like a 10th or a 9th grade student in history class or in social studies, you're really going to understand this term, is from the ingenuity of Rome. We have the really popular and positive success of what's called cultural diffusion. Rome was not an ideologically sort of possessed nation that would be incredibly xenophobic and like intensely supremacist in its ideas with other cultures. It was not closed-minded, in other words. It was very willing and very, very eager to learn and to kind of diffuse other ideas into each other and into themselves. So with trade, with its connection with the other countries that it would dominate, or other kingdoms that it would interact with, it loves doing that. Some cliche examples. I don't know if I have a picture of it here. Let's see, some cliche examples that you can see this even in its structure. Do I have a, yeah, kind of not really. But if you go into Rome, even to this day, or if you look at pictures of ancient Rome, you'll see this little circuit that would be in Caesar's, I think by Caesar's, one of Caesar's palaces or his backyards. Basically what you have here, displayed in the center of this athletic ring, are a bunch of different structures from different areas around the empire. And I believe there was also an obelisk there, which is, of course, from ancient Egypt. And that I like to use as an example of Rome's kind of cultural ingenuity, where it would love to bring in these elements from other cultures and highlight them and kind of add them to their own. So they would have Egyptian architecture. They would have kind of African architecture. One of the most famous ones, of course, was that they adopted the the Greek pantheon of gods, right, and kind of reintegrated them into their own Latin traditions and Latin names. So we would see, the same myths. Like, I mean, the whole Roman author Ovid is, of course, retelling and collecting the Greek myths, but telling it in the Latinate form. And of course, by the way, I'm gonna catch so much rage from my Roman lovers out there that I did not include a section in this unit about Aeneas and the Aeneid in Virgil's Aeneid, in Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid, which is essentially a Roman attempt to create a sequel to the Odyssey and the Iliad in a Roman kind of tradition. That, of course, is another idea of like the cultural diffusion, the cultural integration and ingenuity that these guys had, that they draw on the literature and the traditions of ancient Greece and try to kind of create their own version of it. So again, if I have more time in the future, I will absolutely go back and include a brief video on the Aeneid itself as a piece of literary work, because it's worth looking at, it's worth reading for sure, especially if you like Homer. Now, another example of this is, and the reason I've given it is right here. It is the whole structuring of a boat, right? The kind of fable or the story that goes around is that Rome, in its battles with Carthage and all of its military campaigns and naval campaigns, it didn't really have a strong navy, and then it eventually found a boat or a ship kind of wrecked on its shores, and through their own ingenuity, they were able to deconstruct and reverse engineer this particular structure, this ship, but they also added on things that would allow them to be more successful. So for example, because they were not a huge naval force, they had a much, much more developed army, like kind of land-based army. So what did they do? They simply created a naval force that were able to board other ships, as we see with their big their ladders there, and they were able to confront the people on that ship as if they were fighting a land battle. So thus they became an incredibly powerful naval force as well. As you could obviously see, if they're placed in the center of this massive sea, the Mediterranean Sea, they of course need to be a strong naval force as well. So that's one thing. So a lot of civilizations would do well to learn from Rome's ingenuity and its adopting and kind of integrating things from other cultures. I'm reminded always of I think it's Saint Augustine. It's one of those saints with the A names. But he always would say, and the phrase always came back to me that speaking within the body of Christianity, speaking from the tradition of Christianity, this particular saint always said we should take the quote unquote spoils of the Egyptians. And he's, of course, referring back to when Israel leaves, the Hebrews leave Egypt, that they want to take with them the things that are useful from Egypt. And that is a typical thing. We're going to see it in Christianity, by the way, but we see it also in a cultural and kind of civilization mode here as well. That you should take things that are useful and that are consistent with your values and that are practical and good from other cultures as well. You should not be so culturally, extreme and kind of alienating and what we would call today racist, and totally want to reject everything from a culture simply by virtue of being from a different culture than you. No, if you see something that is useful and something that is good, integrate it into yourself, into your own civilization. It makes it more powerful, makes it more strong. That is, in some sense, one of the things that really contributed to Rome's success, is that it was able to say, oh, look, the Ethiopians have this great, invention here. Oh, look, Greece has all this great stuff here. Let's grab that. Oh, look, the barbarians up there in the north have a bunch of wonderful things here. Let's integrate that. And they were able to kind of create this amazing melting pot and crucible while maintaining their identity as Romans and their belief in their own superiority as Romans. They still took as much innovation as they could from other sources. Thus, they were able to really establish a firm success in the field of technology, right? Roman technology is still envied to this very day. Three basic examples, and one of them being kind of fun for me, is, of course, the roads, right? Roman roads, you fly 8 hours from New York over to Rome nowadays, and you're still going to see the exact same roads that Caesar walked on. They're right there. Okay, I don't know how they did it. We're still trying to reconstruct to this day, but their roads, in the year 100 AD, are somehow more structurally sound than our roads are in America in the year 2024. Right? It's amazing. So those are still there. And why, by the way, were roads so important in an empire and a republic that spanned this far? We can see pretty obviously it's so that they can act sort of as like the blood vessels in this particular body of an empire. So we can move materials, we can move people, we can move wealth and supplies at a really fast pace throughout the empire. So wonderful thing with roads there. Aqueducts, of course, amazing, innovation of technology that they were able to get running water. They were able to get fountains working. They were able to have all of these materials, again, going back to that Romulus and Remus idea of this kind of integration of nature into into the natural world, into their effective society and their effective culture. Very, very well done and very much success when it comes with the aqueducts. Okay, it's fantastic. And I always like to throw this in there, the creation of the use of heated floors. So yeah, Romans, as you can see in this picture over here, they would have their kind of, their marble or their stone flooring, and then underneath it, they would actually have effective like little furnaces where you could heat a floor in the more kind of colder northern areas of Italy or around the empire. Amazing, right? Where are my heated floors? Nowadays in 2024, it's amazing that they were able to do this. So there's many, many more examples of this. If you take a good Latin class or a good Roman history class in college, they'll walk you through all of the different ways they would cook, all the different ways they would clean, and do their farm work, and just maintain what is effectively a very sophisticated and impressive civilization for being almost 2,000 years old. It's really interesting. And the last one that I'd like to mention is the contributions that Rome has had to the world of religion. Now, specifically with the religion of Christianity. So as we know, Christianity emerged as a religion during the Roman Empire, kind of right at the beginning of the Roman Empire. And as a result, Rome has a little bit of tension with Christianity, as we will see, right? They don't like the Christians at first. But Christianity, through essentially the means of just spreading by word of mouth and word of kind of belief, it spreads and it integrates itself into the Roman civilization. And eventually, as we know with Constantine, is adopted as the official official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, why is this impactful? Well, if you go back to this particular map here, And if we go back all the way to the very beginning of the foundational notes on in our discussions about the humanities in general, we know that there is a little bit of tension with the whole discussion of having a Eurocentric view of history and why do we focus on the Western civilization so much, blah, 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 blah. I think one really, again, kind of cold, pragmatic way to look at that, maybe a little bit biased way to look at that, is to say that the European world had very, very quick advancements and an incredible what's called influential power on the rest of the world. So we see that especially in the Roman Empire. So what happens? Rome controls the Mediterranean world, controls a lot of Northern Africa, controls a lot of the Middle East, has interactions with the Far East, and controls the majority of Europe as well. Well, and as a result, guys, if you drop something into the stream that is the Roman civilization, where is that thing going to travel? It's going to spread then throughout the rest of the world where Rome has influence, which is essentially the entire world minus the Americas right now. So by Christianity essentially spreading into Rome and then really kind of like essentially taking over Rome, it spreads Christianity, therefore, across the known world. So we really, in some sense, have Rome to thank or to condemn, depending on your point of view, for the spread and the essential dominion of Christianity in the ancient world. So as a result of this is the joke that I told earlier. Some historians like the joke, like a couple of my teachers like the joke, is that at the fall of Rome in 476, it didn't really fall. It just kind of changed its profession. It stopped being a big, cultural empire, and it shifted into being a religious institution, into the Church of Rome, right, which still exists to this day. The church established in Rome by St. Peter still exists to this day, and takes the form of the Vatican, which you can go visit to this day. So in some sense, that part of ancient Rome still is around to this very day. Now, those are the four major contributions that I would throw at us if we want to understand Rome generally. Now, next class, what we're going to look at are a couple different primary sources. The first one is going to be about the Roman Republic's conflict with a man named Hannibal Barca. We're going to take a look at that. And then we're going to look at some of the passages or a passage about the character and death of Julius Caesar. So the man who kind of turns the Republic into an empire or pushes it over the fence to becoming an empire. And then we're going to read probably just one passage from, I think it's St. Augustine, on the fall of Rome and what that whole process looked like for him. And we're going to reflect on all three of those. We're going to see what they can tell us about ancient Rome overall. We'll do that, and then we will essentially be done with Rome. Again, very, very quick. I just want to give you a brief overview of its kind of role in history. And then once we are done here with Rome, we're going to move very quickly into a little bit of a longer unit, which will cover essentially all of the world religions. Alrighty? But until then, have a fantastic day, and we will see you later.